This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, welcome everyone. Good morning. Shalom Aleichem. Bruchim Habayim. This will be the penultimate Shiur before Tisha B'av. And we're going to discuss today the format and the pattern with which Echa was written. Echa is one of the Ksuvim, one of the 5 Megillas, and was written Baruch HaKodesh. And we're going to study the format and the mold with which Echa was crafted. The Navi Yirmiyah in Parak Lamed Zayin, Pasuk Lamed Beis, says, V'Yirmiyahu lakach Megillah acheres. And Yirmiyah took another Megillah. Vayitna el Baruch ben Neriah, and he gave it to his scribe, Baruch ben Neriah HaSofer. Now this is in the aftermath of when Yehoiakim was served up the first version of the predictions of gloom and doom, and he burnt it on the brazier. And when they read to him, Eicha Yoshev Badad, she sits, alas, she sits in solitude. So Yehoiakim says, who cares, as long as I'm the king. And then they read to him the pasuk, Bachai Sifke Balayla, she weeps bitterly at night, and Yehoiakim said, who cares, as long as I'm the king. And then they said to him, Golsa Yehuda Meyoini, he says, who cares? Now, who cares? Until they got up to the pasuk, Hayehut Sareha L'Roy Shayev Shalu. So until they got up to the pasuk that the enemy would be the leaders of the city and the kings would go into exile, and he was very disturbed and he burned Eicha, whereupon Yirmiyah took another Megillah and he gave it to Baruch the Sofer, and they wrote it from Yirmiyah, is called Divrei HaSefer, all the words of the book, Asher Saraf Yehoiakim Melech Yehuda Ba'esh. So they rewrote whatever Yirmiyah had previously written. V'oid noisef aleim dvarim rabim kahema. And they also added dvarim rabim kahema, says the Medrash Rabbah and Eicha, Reb Chama bar Chanina Pasach. The Yirmiyahu lakach Megillah acheres, Yirmiyah took another scroll. V'yitna el Baruch ben Neriah HaSofer, and he gave it to Baruch ben Neriah. V'yichtov aleh, and he wrote on it mipi Yirmiyahu. Is called Divrei HaSefer, all the words of the book Asher Saraf Yehoiakim Melech Yehuda Ba'esh, that Yehoiakim burned in the fire. V'oid noisef aleim dvarim rabim kahema, shein tamad loymar kahema. What does it mean, kahema? It should say, and they added other things. What's kahema? Matam lemer kahema of Kahana Amar. V'oid noisef aleim dvarim rabim kahema. Dvarim Echa Yashva, Echa Ya'iv, Echa Yuam. Dvarim refers to the 3 Echas. Zachar Hashem, Rabim, Zachar Hashem. That's Perek Hey. Kahema, Ani HaGever. Because Ani HaGever is the equivalent of the 3 Echas. Because we know Perek Aleph, Perek Beis, and Perek Dalet begin with the word Eicha. And Perek Gimel, Ani HaGever, does not begin with Eicha. However, we know Perek Aleph, Beis, and Dalet each consists of 22 psukim for each letter of the Aleph Beis. But Perek Gimel consists of 66 psukim, Keneged all 3 Eichas. V'hutlasa tlasa psukim, hadahu dechsiv. This is what it means. Halai kasafti lecha shalishim. Behold, I have wrote for you 3s, dvarim mishulashim. Manners which are thrice peated. In other words, Ani HaGever is thrice peated. Ani HaGever has shalosh ape. Ani HaGever ani b'shevet avrasa. Right, 3 alephs, 3 bases, 3 gimels. So let's try to study this. We have 5 prakim in Megillas Eicha, which is very interesting. Parak Aleph and Beis and Dalet begin with Echa. Why begin with Echa? Parak Gimel does not begin with Echa. Why not? Why does Parak Gimel have 66 psukim? Why does Parak Aleph, Beis, and Dalet have 22 psukim? Parak Hey also has 22 psukim, but it's not in accordance with the Aleph Beis. What's the meaning of all of this? Why? Now, just we're going to change things up a little bit today. We know that Parak Gimel begins with the words Ani hagever ani b'shevet. Who's Ani hagever? Rashi says Yirmiyah. Ani hagever is gematria Yirmiyahu. That's an amazing gematria of the stipler. That the words of Rashi are the gematria of the pasuk. This is a frequent trick of the stipler, where you have a pasuk, you have the comments of Rashi, and often the comments of Rashi may be the gematria of the pasuk. So, actually, the stipler was asked whether people should work on gematrias. He says no. So they said, "What do you mean? You wrote a whole sefer, you wrote a whole collection of gematrias in the back of the Berachos Peretz." He says, "No, these I didn't work on them. They just came to me during Kriyas HaTorah." When you're the stipler, these things just come to you. But now we're going to study the format of Eicha. The Maral in the Sefer Netzach Yisrael, Parak Yotes, the Maral teaches us, let me just see, that V'seder Yirmiyah, Gimel Eicha, Maschilin Ve'echa, 3 Eichas begin with the word Eicha, Ve'ilu Ani HaGever, Einoi Maschil Ve'echa. And the Maral says an amazing thing. Kinira Gimel Eicha Yasad Al Chorban Bayis Rishain. The 3 Eichas were formulated for the first Beis HaMikdash. What's interesting is if you look in the Gemara in Sanhedrin on Daf Kuf Daled, the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, B'mnei ma laku be'eicha. Why were they stricken with Eicha? B'mnei she'avru al lamed vav krisos shabatayra, because they violated the 36 krisos in the Torah. So Eicha is gematria 36. So the reason why we were stricken with Eicha is because we violated all 36 krisos. So the Maral has a chap that we know that Klal Yisrael only violated the 36 krisos by Bayis Rishain. The Gemara says Bayis Rishain was because of Avodah Zarah, Giloi Arayos, and Shvichas Damim. But Bayis Sheni, they were Oisik V'Torah Gemilas Chasadim, was only because of Sinas Chinam. And therefore, Bayis Sheni, they didn't violate the krisos. And therefore the perek that corresponds to Bayis Sheni does not begin with Eicha. What perek corresponds to Bayis Sheni? Ani hagever ani b'shevet ebrasai. So the Eicha, Yuam, Eicha Yoshev Badad, Eicha Yuam, Eicha Ya'iv, that's for Bayis Rishon, because Bayis Rishon they violated the krisos. Bayis Sheni is Ani hagever. Now, umibnei ki Bayis Rishon chara b'shvil gimel dvara. Now, why are there 3 prakim keneged Bayis Rishon? Well, they violated 3 sins. Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayos, Shvichas Damim. So for each one of these sins, you have another perek. Right? Umibnei ki Bayis Rishon chara b'shvil gimel dvara, Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayos, Shvichas Damim. Asher nizbaru l'mala, l'chein keneged zeh, yasad gimel Echa. But Ani HaGever is for Bayis Sheni. And Bayis Sheni, they only violated 1 sin. And therefore for Bayis Sheni, there's only 1 perek. V'ilu Ani HaGever, whom yusad achorban Bayis Sheni, v'yesh bai, gimel alpha beta. Kim ibnei shenechra Bayis Sheni al sinas chinam. Because the second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed for sinas chinam, v'hi shkula keneged gimel chatoim, avodah zarah gil arash shvichas damim, kedisa b'meseches yuma, Sha'amru sham malamid sheshkola sinas chinam neged avodah zarah gil arash shvichas damim, l'cheina yesh ban yagever gimel alpha beta, b'mnei shum yisrael chorban Bayis. This is mamish oyoim v'noira. Bayis Rishon, there were 3 sins, and therefore the 3 prakim keneged Bayis Rishon. Bayis Sheni, there was only 1 sin, therefore Bayis Sheni only has 1 perek. But that 1 sin was sinas chinam, and sinas chinam is the equivalent of all 3 big sins. Therefore, Rabbi Isai, by the perek that corresponds to Bayis Sheni, even though it's only 1 perek, but each letter has 3 words. Each letter, has 3 psukim. In other words, Avodah Zarah is perek aleph of Echa for Bayis Rishon. Gilui Arayos is the 2nd perek. Shvichas Damim is the 4th perek. The third parak is Keneged Sinas China, but Sinas China is equal to all three. Now, interestingly, even though there are 3 psukim in parak Gimel for each letter, but the psukim are very short. Ani agerani b'shevet evrosay toiv la'gever shisa benurav chadoshim la'bekarim rabba emunasa. The psukim are very, very short, and that's because we could suggest, Rabbeinu Yonah teaches us that how is Sinas Chinam the equivalent of Gilui Arayah, Shvichas Dam, and Avodah Zarah? Not straight up. It's not one act of Sinas Chinam that's the equivalent of all 3, but Sinas Chinam, because it's such a small sin, it's likely repeated again. Rabbeinu Yonah likens it to strands of silk, where each strand you could rip it, but when you double, triple, quadruple it, it becomes very strong. So too, the sin of Sinas Chinam, yes, in fact, it is equal to all big 3, but each one in and of itself is very small, and therefore, Paragimel has 3 small psukim for each pasuk. V'lachein loy pasach be'echa. That's why Parak Gimel does not begin with Echa, because by Bayesheni they did not violate Chayvei Krisos. Echa is Gematria 36. The 36 Chayvei Krisos ki Bayis Rishon hayubale Avera. Bayis Rishon they were sinners. V'avru lamed vav Krisos. Ch'meish mavor b'Yechezkel. Shezachar esrim v'arba Averos b'parsha shel Hasishbait. The Gemara in Tainus says that they violated all 24 sins because the Parak B'Tainus Shtayim Rois Asami. They violated Shnayim v'Esrim. Therefore, it begins with Eicha, not Ani HaGever. Ani HaGever. Each letter of Ani HaGever has 3 psukim for each letter of the Aleph Beis, which is Keneged Bayesheni. And what about the 5th parak? The 5th parak doesn't begin by Eicha and does not go in the order of the Aleph Beis. Well, says the Maharal Aval B'Zachar Hashem Mehayalanu B'Zeh Yasad Yirmiyah Chorban Haaretz. This Yirmiyah enacted on the destruction of the land. Shagalu Mimenu. They were exiled when they sha'avru ala Torah. They violated the Torah. Lakach Yesh B'Zachar Hashem Mehayalanu Gamkein Chaf Beis Psukim. Therefore, Zachar Hashem Mehayalanu also has 22 psukim, because it corresponds to the destruction of the land. Rak she'ein zachar Hashem hoylech ba'alpha beis k'ma Echa. It does not go in the order of the Aleph Beis, ki Echa yasa achorim beis hamikdash. Echa, the prakim that begin by Echa, corresponds to the Chorban Beis Hamikdash. And that reaches the very epitome and very source and very beginning that nothing is above it, and therefore it goes in the order of the Aleph Beis to indicate that it reaches the very foundation of existence. Aval Zachar Hashem Ahayalanu, that was enacted on the exile from the land, and the land is not like the Beis Hamikdash in that it should reach the very beginning. In other words, there's a concept that the Beis Hamikdash is the very foundation of the world, and to indicate that, the order of the parak is formulated by the order of the Aleph Beis. Lekach ein hoylech Zachar Hashem Ehayalanu ba'alpha Beis. Therefore, it does not go in the order of the Aleph Beis. Rak sheyesh by chav Beis psukim. It just has 22 psukim. So, if anybody wanted to know how many psukim in Eicha, 22, 22, 22, 22, Aleph Beis, Dalet, and Hey each have 22. That's 88. Plus 66. So what's 88 plus 66? Do we have any nuclear physicists here to do this very complicated 154, right? I believe. So there are 154 psukim in Eicha. Aval Zachar Hashem Ehayalanu. Fine. Nimsa ki sefer kinas yasad Yirmiyah Chorban Beis Hamikdash Rishon Chorban Beis Hamikdash Sheni ve'al asher golom min haaretz. And these are the 3 tragedies: Chorban Bayis Rishon, Chorban Bayis Sheni, destruction of the land. And this is what the Gemara in Chagiga darshans on Hey Amud Beis. V'damayat tidma'inai v'seirat einai dehima. These are the 3 tears that Yirmiyah cried, one for Bayis Rishon, one for Bayis Sheni, and one for Churban Haaretz. Comes the Maral. Now, I would ask personally, and if you don't have an answer to this, I'll still be your friend, but I think it's an interesting thing to think about. And that is, if Aleph, Beis, and Daled are Bayis Rishon and Gimel is Bayis Sheni, why in that order? In other words, why is the perek that corresponds to Bayis Sheni stuffed in right in middle of Aleph, Beis, and Daled? You would expect the 3 Eichas to go together and the Ani HaGever should be after them. Why is it sort of intertwined? I was just thinking about this morning. Okay, we could proceed now with the rest of the share. Okay. V'oid nira lefarish. It would also seem we could explain Ki elu gimel Eicha yasad Yirmiyah neged gimel dvarim shaba aleim hagalas min artsam. They correspond to the 3 tragedies that befell them during exile. V'oid ba aleim hacherev, the sword. V'oid ba harav, and hunger, shu kiloyan afel aktanim, which is hunger, and that brings devastation even to the young. Because very often in warfare, the marauding soldiers will only destroy the adults, sometimes leaving over the children, but hunger equally affects even the youth. Aval harav hu shayach yosel aktanim. In other words, bali mochamen shochin yom lahamas aktanim. Often warriors will not attack the young. Aval harav hu shayach yosel aktanim. But hunger is more relevant to the youth. Ki hagadol yachal afarnes atzmai. An adult could support himself, but how will the youth support themselves? So that is number 1 is sword. The sword is everyone. Then is hunger, and followed by galus. In other words, number 1 is galus, exile. Exile, as we're about to see, is for the women. Ve'ikar agos hulanoshim. Exile hits the women harder. Ki anoshim and Yoshev Badad. Men, anyway, they're gallivanting all day, but women, they're in their house, or at least they should be, and therefore, women are more sensitive to the hardship of galus, because women, their role, their place is in their home. Ki kol kvuda bas melech panima. So you have galus, you have cherev, and you have rav. Galus is exile, cherev is the sword, and rav is hunger. Exile affects the women, the sword affects the men, and hunger affects everyone. Therefore, in Parak Alech, Eicha Yoshev Badad, this corresponds to galus, like the pasuk says, galus Yuda me'oini. And if you notice, the whole Parak Aleph is in Lashon Nekeva. Hayesa ki almana.
Not a valid menu option.
My singing is not a valid menu option. Okay, so v'chol Eicha ze Lashon Nekeva. This Eicha is Lashon Nekeva. And we continue Haisa ki almana. So in the Lashon Nekeva, ki davar ze neged hagalos shayach yoser l'noshim shamarnu v'neishim yeshvim l'kaiman. So Parak Aleph is keneged galos, and then we talk about Parak Beis, the sword. Keneged acherev shabalem l'kach amar Eicha ha'yav v'yapay Hashem. And then we have Gada b'chariyav koyo keren Yisrael. We talk about the sword that berefs. Darach kashtoi ki oyeg vayaroi komach v'neyoyin. Right, so it talks about the murder, and this is keneged the men. But the 4th parak talks about the children. Eicha ha'yuam zahav. That's keneged the ktanim. And keneged the hunger. That's why in pasuk Aleph, Eicha yuam zav tishtapechna avnei kodesh b'rosh kol chutzos. That is a reference to the beautiful children of Yerushalayim. However, what about, so we have Perek Aleph is Keneged Galos, Perek Beis is Keneged hunger, is Keneged, the sword, and Perek Dalet is Keneged hunger. And what is Perek Gimel? Because Perek Gimel is as long as 1, 2, and 4. That there is actually one tragedy that includes all of the above. Aval ani hagever hu keneged hashvi. Ani hagever corresponds to captivity. Shenosnu biyad oiveim, that they were placed in the hands of their enemy. The davar zeh b'fnei atzmai, this matter stands on its own. And captivity is relevant to men, women, and children. Shahakoil hoilech b'shvi limkaroisam. People go into captivity to be sold, even the youth, but to be able to be used for all of their needs. And all three are possibilities. They're in Shavi, there could be exile, and there could be murder, if the captor wants, he could murder, chas v'shalom. And sometimes they don't give to eat, and this is what we say in the first parak of Baba Basra, that Shavi is Keneged Kulam. Like the pasuk says in Yirmiyah, Asher lamaves lamaves, Asher lacherev lacherev, Asher larav larav, Asher lashvi lashvi. And the Gemara says in the first parak of Baba Basra, the Shvi isnahu kulubai. All three are in Shvi, and therefore the third parak has 3 aleph bases. In other words, aleph base and dalid, one is Keneged Galos, one is Keneged the sword, and one is Keneged hunger. And Parak Gimel has 3 aleph bases corresponding to all 3. V'haravi shu ani hagever Keneged hashvi. V'da ki hashvi shenimtza b'ay shlosh v'amelu k'may she'amru zal v'kach ani hagever yesh b'ay gimel alpha beta. Mikal makom lo nimtza b'ay b'haflaga rak b'davar ma. In other words, let's explain, well, why is it that Perek Aleph, Beis, and Dalet are long and Perek Gimel is short? The answer is because Ki Hashvishin Zo Shadam Elu Kamai Sham Rozal Kach Neger Shigam Abo Mikol Makom Lo Nitzah Vlag Rak V'Davar Ki Ein Hashvi Bo B'Kach Olav Kol Kach. It's not like the captor is going to impose all 3 very strongly. It's sort of, they're all just possibilities, albeit somewhat remote, and therefore the psukim are much shorter. So L'kach Be'ilu Gimel Zachar Lashon Echa. Echa is much more extreme, because in Bayis Rishon they experienced, because one is Keneged Galos, which is an extreme, one is Keneged the sword, which is extreme, and one is Keneged hunger, which is an extreme. But in captivity, even though all 3 are possibilities, but they're just somewhat remote, and therefore they're shorter. It's even deeper than we said. Yoser mimashe kosov hema. More than it says here is in Eicha. Now, Rabbi, according to this pshat, we could also ask, why would it, if it's talking about Golos, Cherev, and Rav, why would it interrupt with Shavi? All we added is, according to the first pshat, that it's Keneged, Avodah Zarah, Gilas, and Shvichas Damim. We sort of explained also why the psukim are short, and that is also because the manner in which Sinas Chinam is equal to all 3 is in a shorter manner. In other words, it's the conglomerate effect. Okay, my Rabbi, I would like to just focus on a few important nekudas and limudim that we learn out from Eicha. And one interesting question is, the Gemara in Sanhedrin says on Daf Kuf Daled, Eicha Yoshev Badad Amar Rabbi Amar Rabbi Yochanan. God said, I wanted you to dwell Betach Vayishkoin Yisrael Betach V'Dain Yaakov El Eretz Dagon V'Sirosh Af Shamav Yarfutal. God said, I wanted you to dwell securely Badad, but now I wanted you to dwell Badad Moishavam, but now you're Eicha Yoshev Badad. So what exactly does this mean? I wanted you to be Shoichein Badad, but instead it's Eicha Yoshev Badad. And furthermore, here in this pasuk, Badad seems to indicate a high madrega. Vayishkoin Yisrael betach Badad in Yaakov, like Bilam said, Heinam levadad Yishkoin. And why is it in Kinnis it has this negative connotation of Echa Yashva Badad L'gnai? And in Mitzvah also it says Badad Yeshev. So why is it in Devarim and in Bilam the word Badad is considered a attribute, an accolade? In other words, it's considered a maila to dwell Badad. And in Eicha, or by the Mitzvah, it's considered a deficiency. Says Reb Shimon Schwab, he heard from his son Rav Meir Yerucham, that the difference is not in the word Badad, but in the word Yishkoin or Yeshev. When you're Yeshev Badad, the connotation is you're a loner. You're sitting all by yourself. You're forsaken. You're forlorn. When you're Shoichein Badad, Shoichein means your enemies. The other nations of the world are your shachein. They're your neighbors. They want to come close to you, like the pasuk says, "V'naharu elav kol hagayim." But they can't because we're above them. We're more eminent than them. We're the Am HaNivchar. We're badad. As much as they want to approach us, they're our neighbors, but they cannot associate with us. God says, I wanted you to be shoichein badad, where everyone surrounds you, everyone's your neighbor, but you have the prestige where they cannot come close to you because you're much more elevated. You're not forlorn or forsaken. You're the envy of all the world. All the world throngs to you. You're shoichein badad, but instead you have to suffer the sorry fate of Yoshev Badad, like it says by the Mitzvah. Okay, I want to bring to your attention something very interesting. This Ramah over here, number 11, I'm sorry, you can't really read it. But the Ramah is in Siman Tav Kuf Nun Tes Ziv Daled. The Ramah says that the Kriya for Tisha B'av is Ki Soilid Banim Uvnei Banim, and then Haftarah is Asoif Asifeim Noam Hashem. And then the Ramah says, every Kaddish that you say after Eicha, until you leave the shul in the morning, we do not say Tiskabel. Herstamaisa, Leil Tisha B'av, you do not say Tiskabel in Kaddish. Now if you look in the Beis Yosef, he says that the reason is it has something to do with Eicha. What does it have to do with Eicha? Because in Umashakasav, V'achar V'amar Kaddish V'loi Tiskabel, that's what it says in Agos Mamani. And the reason is because we say in Eicha, Sasam Tfilasi. Gam ki ezak v'ashaveya, Sasam Tfilasi. Even when I cry out, Hashem blocks out our tefillah. By that token then, the Kaddish you say before Eicha, you do say Tiskabel. So you're going to say Kaddish Shalem with Tiskabel before Eicha, and then another Kaddish Shalem after Eicha without Tiskabel. Now, the Gemara says...
Isn't there a minhag among some Beis Avelim that you daven in a Beis Avel, but they don't say Tiskabel in a Beis Avel? When that makes sense, that after you read Eicha, you really have... It's like we're Avelim. Mamish Kamo Shiva.
Well, that's not the reason. In other words, the reason we don't say Tiskabel is not a sign of Avelos. It's rather because in Eicha it says, even when we cry out and scream out, Hashem blocks out our tefillah, and that's based on the Gemara in Brachas Amud Beis, V'amar Rebbe Lazar miyom shechara beis hamikdash ninalu sharei tefillah, the gates of heaven are locked. Shenemar gam ki ezak v'ashaveya sasam tefilasi. Now, Another interesting thing that we learn from a pasuk in Eicha. In Eicha, Beis pasuk Yud Zayin. Let's see how I do this. Oh, here we go. Beautiful. Bitza emrasoi asher tziva mimei kadem. Literally, God carried out His plan that He intended from yesteryear. So from these words, Bitza emrasoi, we learn out another few important halachas. Number one, Umeisirin haparoiches milafnei ha'aroin. We remove the paroiches the night of Tisha B'av al shem Bitza emrasoi, because of the pasuk of Bitza emrasoi. Bitza emrasoi could also mean he ripped his royal robe. By the way, that's why we do not wear talis Tisha B'av morning. Noyagin shleiniach tefillin b'Tisha B'av shachs v'loi talis. Why? Al pi the medrash Bitza emrasoi. Biza porpira delay. He ripped his royal robe. That refers to the talis. And then we say, Hishlich mishamayim eretz tiferes Yisrael. He threw his tefillin down. That's why we don't wear tefillin. Now an interesting question. Eicha you am zahav. Tijne. What does it say in Perek Daled Pasuk Aleph? Eicha you am zahav. And then it says Tishta pechna avnei kodesh b'roish kol chutzais. It says the holy stones have poured on every street. Banim hameirim ka'avanim tova. So Medrash Agada. Kol revi'is dam sheyatza Yoshiyahu. We know that Parai Nechai sent word to Yirmiyah that he wanted to pass through Eretz Yisrael to wage war against Assyria in the northeast, and Yirmiyah defied Parai Nechai because Yoshiyahu did not allow Parai Nechai to go through, and the reason he didn't let him go through is because he held that when the Jewish people do the bidding of God, no nation will travel through Eretz Yisrael even to do war against another nation. And he mistakenly had a better impression of Jewish people than they were on. And therefore, Parai Nechai defied him, and he traveled through Israel, and he shot Yoshiyahu with 300 arrows, and he pierced his body like a sieve. And the Medrash Haggadah says that every revius of blood, right? Chazal tell us Yirmiyah went running over to the fallen Yoshiyahu, and he heard the dying words of Yoshiyahu. What were Yoshiyahu's dying words? He said, Tzadik hu Hashem kipiu marisi. In other words, he was matzdik the din. But here we find kol revius dam sheyatza Yoshiyahu. Every revius of blood that emanated from Yoshiyahu, b'chol chetz v'chetz shenoatzu by, from every arrow that got stuck in him, ba Yirmiyah came koivrai, and he haya Yirmiyah koivrai. Yirmiyah would bury it b'mekayma. The Allahu koivrai, and about this he reads Tishta pechna avnei kodesh. So we have a very interesting question on this, because Yirmiyah, what was Yirmiyah? We just learned 2 Shabbos ago. Divrei Yirmiyahu ben Chilkiyahu min hakohanim asher ba'nosais b'eretz Binyamin. Yirmiyah was a kohen. Comes the Rashash, and the Rashash in his commentary to the Medrash says, Lashon Rashi be'echal kol revius dam haya Yirmiyah koivrai. Wait a second, how can Yirmiyah bury each ounce of blood? But blood is metame, and a kohen is not allowed to be metame himself. What are you going to say? It's a meis mitzvah? I mean, there were Jewish soldiers everywhere. How is Yirmiyah allowed to do this? So the Rashash says, look in Brachos, Daf Yutesam Beis, Tosus Derei Amaschem Medalgid, that Tosus is inclined to say, De'ein kohen muzar revius dam k'moshe ein nazir megaleach. A kohen is not warned on a revius of blood just like a nozer is not megaleach if he comes in contact with the revius of blood. V'yisyashiv b'zeh gimgum ha-yifei anaf v'miloshen Rashi yotzu b'chlal cholchez shenotzu mashli shiyotzu b'den. So that's one answer. One possible answer is a kohen is not muzar on a revius of dam. But you could say that the lashon of Rashi means each arrow that pierced him, mashmali shiyotzu b'denu b'chayim chiyusay v'dam menachei eno metame. The blood of a living person perhaps is not metame, says the Rashash. Now, if you notice in Parak Beis, if you have an Echa on you, handy, the prakim go by the order of the Aleph Beis. Aleila anhi vaychiyah Perisat siyain biyadeha. So we have ayin, pei, and the whole Parak Aleph goes in the order of the Aleph Beis, and lo and behold, we come to Parak Beis, and it's Patsu alayich bihem kol yavayich asa adoi shem. So we have the pei before the ayin. And the Gemara in Sanhedrin Daf Kuf Dalet says, why does it say pei before the ayin? Rava Amar Rava Rabbi Yochanan b'shvil mahiktim pei la'ayin b'shvil meraglim. They spoke with their mouth what they didn't see with their eyes. The meraglim spoke with their mouth what they didn't see in their eyes. So now the question is, if that's the case, why doesn't Parak Aleph begin with a pei? In other words, Parak Aleph should follow the same pattern. Pei ayin. Why does Parak Aleph go in order? This is the question of Reb Shimon Schwab, and he gives a very interesting answer. Says Reb Schwab, because if Parak Aleph would not go in order, we wouldn't know what the order of the Aleph Beis is. We would think the correct order of the Aleph Beis is Pei Ayin. So Parak Aleph goes Ayin Pei and establishes the order of the Aleph Beis. Once the order is established, then everything is good. Then we could flip it so that it's recognizable that we're distorting the order. However, you could ask on Reb Schwab that, do I need Eicha to establish the order of the Aleph Beis? I mean, what about Tehillim? Doesn't Tehillim in Parak, in Ashrei, in Kuf Yotes go according to the order of the Aleph Beis? In other words, why do I need Eicha Parak Aleph to establish the order of the Aleph Beis? The Tamei HaMinhagim gives a very interesting idea, and he says, in Masechta Sotah we find that the Meraglim did not lie entirely. They started off by saying, v'gam zavas cholav udvash, efes ki az ha'am. So they started off by praising Eretz Yisrael. So Rashi says, wait a second, why are they praising Eretz Yisrael? So Rashi says, Kol sheker she'ein emes b'tchilasa ein meskayim b'soifa. Every good lie has some truth in the beginning. So therefore, says the Tamei HaMinhagim, Parak Aleph represents the accurate element of the report that they began with. And then from Parak Beis on, that's where the distortion begins. Mar Rabbi Sai, we will conclude with the following. We're going to conclude with a very important pasuk in Echa, and that is the pasuk says, "Ma yisoynein adam chai gever al chatav." What can a living person complain about? All one could moan about is one's sins. That's a very powerful pasuk. Chazal tell us when Paroi had a Jewish problem on his hands and he needed to come up with the Jewish solution, he convened a court of 3 people. Bilam, and Bilam gave advice to destroy the Jewish people. Eoiv was silent, and Yisro ran away. Bilam was killed. Eoiv was judged with the most horrific Yisurim any human being experienced. Yisro ran away. He was zoicha that his children are situated by the Lishkas Hagazos. Obviously, who deserves worse punishment, Bilam or Eicha? Certainly, Bilam deserves much worse punishment. Bilam advised to destroy. Eicha could not be present. Eicha did not, chas v'shalom, want to look like he was an accomplice, so he ran away. So why did Eicha get a worse punishment than Bilam? Bilam got off scot-free. His head was sliced off, and that was the end of him, and he didn't suffer. But Eicha suffered his whole life. It would seem that Eicha got a much, much worse punishment than did Bilam. Says Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, certainly the punishment of Bilam needs to be much worse than Eicha. Bilam advised Ra on Klal Yisrael. Eicha was silent. But we see in the punishment, Bilam was killed. And Eicha was judged with Yisurim, Noiraim, bitter Yisurim, that no human being could even tolerate and bear. It would seem that the punishment of Bilam was much worse. However, we come to a pasuk in Echa, Ma yisoinehein adam chai. Rashi says, Ma yisraim adam al kol hakores habam alav. How could a person complain about anything he has to endure? Achar achesed shani oisa imai shenasati loy chayim. Hashem says, how could you complain in life? You're alive. If you're alive, you can't complain. By the way, this applies to most people listening to the shiur today. I'm pretty safe assuming that most people in the shiur, I don't know if you're Ashkenazi or Sephardi, if you daven Ashkenaz or Sfard, I don't know what kind of yarmulke you wear, I don't know what color shirt you wear, but one thing I know for sure everyone listening to the shiur has in common is everyone is breathing. Otherwise it would be hard to attend today's shiur. Rashi says, Ma Yisraim Adam Chai. You can't complain because I gave you such a chesed that you're alive. Once a person has accepted a gift from the Creator, imagine if somebody, here's the mashal Reb Chaim Shmulevitz gives. You got to be in it to win it, right? So you're not winning the lottery unless you buy a ticket. So let's say you buy a ticket, and lo and behold, you won. You won $1 million, and then some annoying neighbor calls you up, and he wants to chew your ear off for 90 extra seconds. It's not even going to bother you. You'll tell him, ramble on for another 10 minutes. Well, you're very happy. Why? Because nothing bothers you when you're flying high. Imagine if you won $1 billion and just that moment the football goes through your back window. No problem. You won't even pay attention to any small, trivial annoyance would be negligible. A person needs to appreciate the gift of life. His happiness needs to be to no end. Whatever difficulty you have in life, how do you even pay attention to it if you've been bestowed upon the greatest gift? Even Yisurim Gedolim Ba'atzim Yisrael, even if someone has the worst situation, it should be negligible in comparison to the gift of life. This is what David HaMelech says, God, Yasar Yisrani Ka. God, you could give me affliction, but v'lamaves lo nisanoni. What does this mean? Pashup Shad, God, do with me whatever you want, but don't take away my life. But another pshat is, Av ki yisrani Hashem bisum gedolim. David HaMelech saying, even if God gives me terrible affliction, but if lamaves lo nisanani, I don't even feel it. That's a very chiddushdik pshat. Pashup pshat is, David HaMelech saying, God, do what you want. Don't take my soul. No, there's another pshat. Even if you give me Chas v'Shalom Yisurim, I'm not even margish it because I appreciate the value of life to such an extent. Says Reb Chaim, V'adam ha-Misrayim u'Masana al-Kol Gaz b'Amalav. Someone who complains about the vicissitudes of life, and he's not sensitive to the great fortune. This is referenced in the pasuk Adam bikar v'lo yavin nimshal kabehemos nidmu. A man, he is in great prestige, but he doesn't understand. He's like an animal. What does this mean? Adam bikar. He's given the most precious asset, and he doesn't understand it. Nimshal kabehemos nidmu. He's living like a behemoth, just like a behemoth doesn't appreciate the value of living and life. Someone who allows sort of the challenges of life, and everyone has them, to get the better of him, is lacking in the proper focus. And this is something, sort of a reality check, which is a worthwhile reminder to us really every day of our lives, that if we would have a proper appreciation for the value of life, it would cause our difficulties to some degree be dulled. And therefore, in fact, Bilam suffered a much, much worse fate than Eicha, because Bilam died. And Eicha, yes, he lived a very tragic life, but the gift of life is so great that it could even pale and cause to dull the Yisurim of Eicha. So let's just end off this time for real with one question, and Be'ezus Hashem, everyone's welcome to join us in Muncie next Sunday morning, where we're going to be addressing this next Sunday night. Thank you. Jojo, you should come already in the morning, but you're going to have to stay until the night. But hopefully it will be recorded. And we're going to address the question of the Yad HaMelech. The Yad HaMelech has a very fundamental question on Echa that we'll let you think about for about a week. And that is, the Rambam tells us based on the Gemara that Nevi'im were not able to prophesy at any time, but they had to focus their minds and be in a state of gladness and happiness and well-being and contemplate, because Nevuah resides not out of sadness and not out of laziness, only mitach simcha. So the question is, we know the prophet Yirmiyah wrote Kinos Eicha with tears. It is the most tragic of all the prophecies. And as he describes, V'damaya tidma'ini, he wrote it mitoich demais. How then was he able to write it, Baruch HaKodesh, b'nevuah, if nevuah can only be attained mitoich simcha? It would be, what kind of simcha could Yirmiyah have had, mitoich demais, and prophesying about the future gloom and doom? Mar Rabbi Sai, just a public service announcement, Be'ezus Hashem, we're working very hard to get the new Sefer on the Tanu Meir Balanes. We're trying to get it out before Rosh Hashanah. It's very trying times because of many, many factors. Obviously, the world has come to a standstill, but we're still, I hope, on schedule. We're trying for basically the beginning of September. So if anybody still wants to participate, and also there's Be'ezus Hashem, a Sefer in English coming out on Chanukah with Art Scroll. That will be out hopefully soon after the Yom Tovim. So that's also available. And if anyone's interested, you can let us know. Okay, Rabbi, so thank you so much for listening. Have a great day. And 5 o'clock, if anyone wants to join for Tarma Devaira, you're welcome to join us, of course. And Bracha Batzlacha, have a great day. Shkaya.
How's your grandfather doing?
Chastei Hashem. Thank you. Thank you. Baruch Tia. Baruch Tia. Have a good day, everyone. Shkayach.
Have a good day.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.